So we just need to do a couple of housekeeping areas. I just want to make sure that you guys could hear me, which you can. And also, I'm going to go through the whole webinar first, and then I'll answer your questions. So as you think of it, if you want to write down your question in the Q&A box, that's great. And I will leave maybe about 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. If I don't get to you, I am not going to leave you out high and dry. I will certainly email you and answer your questions. So don't worry about that. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you need to. That's not going to be a problem at all. So I think that's it. As far as the housekeeping, I just want to say again, welcome to my webinar on the steps to the evaluation process and IEP eligibility. I'm going to first talk to you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Karen Lowry. I am an ADHD coach, and I am an IEP coach. How did this happen? My first profession, I was a nurse, and as I started having a family, I worked part-time, and then my fourth child changed my life, and he is now 22. And he was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia. So of course, like you, I was in a position of really upset, confused. Where do I go? How do I help him? What is this? I never heard of it. And I started to learn more about it. I started to volunteer for an organization, a nonprofit called CHADD, C-H-A-D-D, and did a lot of community presentations because that I felt would help others like me who were struggling with that initial diagnosis. And as I did that, I was my son's advocate. Every single year of his school, I was advocating for him because ADHD is just not understood. It wasn't understood then. It's not understood now in many, many cases. And in his case, like so many, he was diagnosed with a combined type, which includes the hyperactivity, impulsivity piece. So he got in trouble a lot, and he wasn't learning. So I was his advocate. As I moved through the systems even more, I decided to become an ADHD coach and later became an IEP coach. And the reason for that is because I realized as a coach, you can't be fully effective unless you know that the child you're coaching is supported in school. And so many times our kids are not supported in school, whether it be learning issues or behavioral issues or just issues that are reflecting executive functioning deficits in their evaluations. If they are not supported, they are not successful, and they have low self-esteem, and they don't do well. And I think the behaviors get worse as well. So it's a whole vicious circle. So I became that coach as well. And that helped me too to continue to advocate for my own son, as well as many other kids along my journey who I have helped, as well as families. So again, as we move into this webinar, so many times our kids are struggling with ADHD for so many reasons. They are not accepted as having a disability, and I see that all the time. And a lot of times it's either because they have a high IQ, or teachers/administrators may not believe in ADHD, or the common support document, the 504, is many times considered optional, so it's not followed. And so they continue to struggle. Another big piece is behavioral issues that create all sorts of problems. And because of the nature of behavior, you know, people just think that, well, I mean, he's got behavioral issues. He could control himself if he wanted to. And we know with the medical diagnosis of ADHD, that is not true. So, again, the beginning of all of this is who's recognizing the need. And I split it into two. Sometimes a teacher will come to a parent and say, you know, these are some of the issues that this child is having in the classroom: attention, impulsivity, boredom, comprehension issues, and behaviors. And or the parent, and many times it is just the parent, realizes there's something going on with this child and something needs to be done. And that many times is homework issues. And I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. Either homework that doesn't even come home to be done, homework that is not understood, homework that they don't want to do, homework that's going to take much too long for this child because of his attention issues. And that goes into, again, missed work, behaviors, oppositional kinds of behaviors related, again, to homework probably, in many cases, grades, failures, and also school emails that are coming in to you as the parent which kind of document that there's something going on, and the parent is supposed to figure out what it is. And the parent is supposed to control that problem at home. Not in school, but at home while the child's in school. And that's not ever going to happen either very easily. So in the middle, we have the child who is wondering if he or she is just not going to make it. Not going to make it. I don't think that question is going to happen in the very beginning as a young child, but as that child moves through the system, middle school, high school, that question is there. And I don't know the percentage offhand, but there's still too many kids who don't finish high school. And this is why. It's not addressed, it's not structured, it's not supported, and they can't make it. And again, going along with that slide, these are some of the things that can come up with the necessity of documenting struggles. There has to be some communication between home and school, and those are some of those red flags that come between home and school that can be documented, whether a teacher is reaching out to a parent or vice versa. And again, teacher comments, any little mini assessments that have been done. Perhaps that child has a 504. There are no formal assessments done for a 504, but certainly there could be little mini assessments that were done. All of those matter. And again, just like I talked about, parental assessments. You are important, you know your child best, and you see what is happening. And again, if your child still has a 504, I mean, you could have a child without one, and we're talking about an evaluation, but your child could have a 504. And another important thing is to be monitoring those accommodations and deciding whether or not they're effective and they're helping those struggles. And important too are not just academics, the grades. Grades are not the only factor, and they don't need to even be a factor in the determination of IEP eligibility, even though schools try to push that. But certainly that is part of the big picture. And again, functional performance. And functional performance is part of what our kids suffer from. ADHD have functional performance issues all the time. And those are the things that can be looked at as well. As an example, I'm talking about organizational kinds of issues, transitioning issues, just initiating what they need to initiate. All of those are part of the executive functioning deficits. So, is a diagnosis needed for an evaluation, for a psychoeducational evaluation? Not necessarily. At some point, that diagnosis needs to happen. But if there are documented struggles and there is a suspicion of a disability, there is need for an evaluation. In all areas of a suspected disability, there can be an evaluation. I listed people who can do that evaluation, whether it be developmental pediatricians, psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, but they all must use the DSM for a correct diagnosis, and that is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, providing criteria, symptoms, and descriptions of mental disorders. And again, a complete physical also to rule out other things that could create similar symptoms. But again, as a side note, I think that sometimes it is believed that our kids are overdiagnosed, but I think sometimes, not a developmental pediatrician, but a regular pediatrician who may not have that much experience in ADHD diagnosis, but is the easy route to go and is willing to make that diagnosis only based on, comments from parents and just behaviors in the school. So sometimes that is not a correct diagnosis, not the best way to go about it. And this is important too, and I have reach outs all the time. If my child has ADHD, why is the school fighting me on support? Because that alone is not going to ensure support. You can't just have a diagnosis and expect to get support. And you also cannot expect that a clinician who suggests support, let's say you took your child to a psychologist and was diagnosed, and that clinician documents the need for a 504 or an IEP, the school does not have to listen to that because the clinician is now gone beyond his level of expertise and is jumping into academics in the school. Just as the school has no right to suggest medication. That is without, outside their realm of expertise. The clinician can't do that either. And again, I see that all the time where the school is ignoring my psychologist's recommendations. They don't always ignore, but they don't have an obligation to listen if they don't see the struggles in the classroom themselves. And obviously the psychologist is documenting a diagnosis, but doesn't see what is happening in the classroom. And that is what you have to show to increase that eligibility factor. What is happening in the classroom? And that is what I mean by it's important to document, to build data for the need for support. So you've now come to the conclusion that you, teacher, or both of you have decided that you would like an evaluation because your child is struggling. And the 504, if it's there, is not working. And remember, I think that if that is happening and you've documented that those things are not working, this is very important to do just because such a high percentage of our kids have some kind of a learning difference. And if they don't, they have issues that really are reflective of executive functioning deficits that come up in these evaluations. So, and you can match them to the struggles in the classroom. So this is really important. So you look at the current support, and all of this has to be in writing. And the struggles, like we just talked about, the struggles that are seen at school because you've gotten emails or because you've talked to the teacher, struggles that you see at home. Remember that screening, and I talked about that regarding 504s, screening is not considered to be an evaluation. That is not a formal evaluation. Another thing that sometimes happens is RTI. RTI is called response to intervention. And that, in some cases, I guess, works for kids who are early on showing some difficulties and there's some small area of support put in place. Maybe it's kind of developmental and they kind of grow out of it. If that is happening, that is not a reason not to evaluate. That can still be ongoing. but a child could still have an evaluation. So you develop this request and you deliver in person, or you mail with a receipt request. The IDEA does not stipulate how long it should be before a school will respond to your letter. So usually it's supposed to be within reason. So generally we say within reason is 7 to 10 days. They are obligated to evaluate when there's suspicion of a disability. Excuse me one second. That's why it's so important for you to document everything you see that's important. That's very important. How long does an evaluation take? It is state to state. It's sometimes 60 days, sometimes 90 days. So what that means is school days, from the day that evaluation begins to the day of the IEP eligibility meeting, cannot be longer than either 60 or 90, depending on your state. So you have to know what that is. So that's really good. Although you can see that if you don't start this process until you're into a semester, it can take, like from September to December to finally make this thing happen, because it does take time. The parent must grant permission for testing. And again, like I said, learning disabilities do highly correlate with ADHD. So, misconceptions leading to an evaluation refusal. So you can have obviously a situation you're thinking you've got all your data documented and there's no reason for the school to refuse you, and they do. Now, why would they do that? Your kid is getting A's and B's. There's no reason for an evaluation. He's been screened. There's no reason. I threw this in, but actually the discrepancy between ability and achievement is if there was a testing done that there used to be a percentage of, if the percentage, there was a discrepancy with, there's some ability, there's X ability, and there's this much achievement. How much discrepancy is there? That is not even though I hear it sometimes at schools look at that stuff, that's not a reason to deny an IEP. So I'm not even talking in that case. I'm not talking about an evaluation, but that's no reason to deny an IEP. The disability must impact educational access. And again, that is why when you're writing the letter, you have to document how you see that medical disability impacting your child's educational access. Can gifted kids be eligible? Absolutely. And I hear these horror stories all the time. They're in gifted classes, and if they're kind of threatened with testing or an IEP. If they have an IEP, they can't be in those classes. That's such ridiculous discrimination, because our kids with ADHD are bright. Now, if they happen to be gifted, there's nothing in writing that says, gifted kids never have disabilities, and gifted kids aren't supposed to be supported. These kids have disabilities and are impacted just like anybody else. If the school has decided to deny an evaluation, they have to offer a PWN, a prior written notice. They must state why they are refusing to initiate or change the identification or evaluate or an educational placement, if that were what we were talking about in this case. Oops, wait a minute, I just messed up here. So they need to explain why. So your response, what's your response going to be? So if you have a child with a 504 and you feel like maybe there could be some tweaks in those accommodations and you want to give it a little bit more time, you could do that. But maybe you feel like you can do that, but you need to have a designated time frame. You need to have consistent communication between home and school to ensure not only is the 504 being followed, but are the accommodations right for your child? That's really important to continue to document, I would say weekly, especially if you've been refused by the school to evaluate, at least for now, and add additional accommodations. Another route might be private testing for school collaboration. You could either pay for your own testing, but again, the only problem with that is they have to look at that private testing, but they don't have to act on it. So you have to be aware of that. You can file a complaint with the state if you believe that it's necessary, or go to due process, which is a very, very last resort, I think. I personally think that it's really important to be aware that lack of educational access has to be documented, and they can't refuse that evaluation. And that's what I see all the time. So I wanted to give you an interesting example, somebody that I had just recently spoken to. And it kind of shows you a lot of things. But the first thing it shows you, it's pretty horrific. It shows you lack of communication between home and school and how this kid fell through cracks. This kid was an 8th grader with a 504 and failed all of her 4 core courses. What did they do? She graduated. She graduated. Imagine that. She had the 504 from 6th grade, and the progression of the journeys there, the grades dropped every year. Obviously no communication, right? So now she's going to high school, and her parent is just pretty scared about the fact that she just failed 8th grade. She was graduated anyway, and obviously still has the issues that created the failures. She reached out to the high school, because now it's too late, the middle school won't deal with her anymore, to test in August, and that was refused because it was the summer, which is not a good reason to refuse, but that's what they did. They offered to observe her when school started for a 4-week period. That's what she was told. That was it. We will observe her for 4 weeks. So I'm asking, what should this mom do? And where has the problem been? My suggestion, don't battle with the high school. Start out with, they want to observe her, okay. So you want a meeting to discuss what that means. What do you mean by observation? Where is she going to be observed? How often is she going to be observed? What will be the criteria that you are watching? And who is going to do this? Secondly, you want communication about these observations on a weekly basis. You want documentation of those observations. Determination of the duration of the gathering, further data for further future evaluation. This mom could also, again, go for an independent educational evaluation, either paid for by herself or paid for by the school. But I think just starting out in high school like this, because, again, the schools are not required to utilize information from the private evaluations, it's really, believe it or not, I think better sometimes to get the school to buy into the need for an evaluation first before you move on to anything private and individual. That happens after the fact. But I think in the beginning, I would recommend just going through this 4-week period and then ending it and then discussing what is being seen. She also said that her child was put in a study skills study hall, which many times I hear that our kids with ADHD who have trouble with organization, pretty much executive deficits, have these study halls that they're put into. Well, what's happening? Again, that should be part of the meeting. What is happening in the study hall that is helping my child? Because I think a lot of times it is noted that it is just a study hall and they just sit there and nothing is happening. So if it is a study skills study hall, I would want to know specifically, well, what study skills are we looking at and how can I see data that she's, getting those skills, or how can I evaluate myself too, how she's improving, or how can you, the school, ensure that that's happening? So those are some of the solutions, I think, in this case, that you would have to think about and decide how you would handle that. And this actually is really still happening right now, so I don't know what the end result is. So going back to the positive end of things, let's say that you have now been granted a psychoeducational evaluation for your child. You have signed permission, the testing has taken place, and the day has come. You get a formal invitation with a date and time. It should be at least 3 days ahead. A list of attendees. You should obtain a draft IEP prior to the meeting. So it's kind of funny too, because we talk about parents being a part of the team, right? So why would there be a draft IEP if we're supposed to be working this thing together? And that's a good question. But it takes so long to get those things done, the basics, that they're going to start it. They're going to start it because they are the professionals. They're going to start the IEP and at least get some of it started so that you can add to it. It is a fluid document. It can be changed at any time. So this just makes for a shorter time to kind of get things moving and get their take on her needs or his needs. I would say too, before you go to a meeting like this, write down concerns and questions. If you can, bring someone with you. It doesn't have to be an advocate. It can be a spouse, it can be a friend. It's pretty overwhelming. I still remember my first IEP meeting. It was just, I can still visualize it. It was just so many people and just me. So I didn't know any better in those days, of course. And I walked in there all by myself. And it was pretty overwhelming. I mean, you get better over time, but rather than feel overwhelmed and to add another set of eyeballs and ears to what's happening, it's kind of nice to have that support. If not, at least minimally consider recording. You do have to let the team know you're recording, and then they will record as well. Another important thing is, after any kind of meeting like this, because you've now received an IEP, make sure you follow up with a letter describing what you heard. You know, it is my belief that this is what happened. You know, you may have added things, you may have brought up concerns that they don't see, that they want to wait on. Lots of important things so that you don't forget and that they know what you heard. And if they don't agree with you or want to make changes, then they have to write back and say, no, that's not exactly what happened. Hopefully they write back and agree, or they don't even agree, they don't do anything, which can be taken as, I guess that's, you know, that is the agreement. That is what I heard that happened in this meeting. And that's important. And again, that first IEP meeting, post-evaluation, I was again thinking of my first IEP meeting, and it is truly a sea of people, just a sea of people. And it can be intimidating, but just remind yourself that, you know, these are professionals and you're the parent. You both have something to say. You are all part of the team, especially you, the parent. So you have a right to be there. You have things to communicate and to contribute. And there is no reason to be intimidated, but just go prepared. And again, in this meeting, discussing the evaluation, you know, prior to the IEP, it should, and again, you're not in the position to choose what the evaluation will be, but it should be in all areas of a suspected disability, or obviously a confirmed disability. Maybe, for instance, you could have a child going in with ADHD, a confirmed disability, and a suspected disability could be a learning difference. So all of that has to be encompassed in that evaluation. And I say under the iceberg because, you know, we don't know yet what it is. Have notes written down to ensure things are covered in the IEP and questions. There's a lot of also questions around signing the IEP. Should we sign? Should we not? It kind of depends, again, on the state. The federal law does not require it, but some states do. And it's kind of confusing in the law because I've read that federal law is supposed to trump state law. But it doesn't really seem to be happening in what I see. If the state has different feelings, laws in place, then that is what the district is going to be following. So just be aware of what the law is in your state. What does it mean when I sign the IEP? Sometimes it means you are agreeing. Sometimes you're signing that you're just at the meeting. What does it mean if I don't sign? Sometimes you'll be told, well, like in Pennsylvania, if you don't sign this IEP, you have 15 days before it goes into effect. Now, that may not be a crisis. It depends on your IEP. But remember, it's also a fluid document that can be changed. But mainly, it's just being aware of what does my signature mean. Now, the other thing, too, is I don't want to confuse you. I'm talking about evaluation and I'm talking about an IEP. You could have an evaluation meeting and an IEP meeting all at the same time, which is pretty awful. You could be offered to have those meetings split, so you have a meeting about the evaluation and then you have an IEP meeting separate. So you have it in 2 different meetings. So that could be really something to be aware of after the evaluation process, to ask, you know, is this meeting going to be just talking about the evaluation? or is this both? And you may want to make sure that those meetings are split. Now, the evaluation meeting may be only by itself because they may be saying that your child is not eligible. But if your child is eligible, maybe you don't want to have those two meetings together. It's just too much. So just be aware of that. Be also aware that parents can write on an IEP. I've heard stories where administrators, teachers yell at parents, say, you can't write on that. You can write on it. If you are to sign it that you agree with it, but there's one or two things you don't agree with, you can write on it. As far as the testing, obviously, I'm not asking you to go to school and be a professional so you can understand testing results. My expertise is not in the testing area either. But what I have consistently seen that I think is important to remember, that in these tests, when many times parents are told, your child does not have a learning disability. And why? Because everything came out average. But if you look at the subscores, and they will be there, you can see areas like processing and working memory, which are executive functioning deficits. You can see how different sometimes they score compared to the rest. And remember, if they're a subscore, they're averaged together, and then they somehow crawl into the average range, right? So everything looks hunky-dory. But in reality, those are areas that are coming up on the low end compared to everything else. And don't they show why a child is struggling in the classroom? Processing language, missing the mark, missing directions, missing notes, all processing. Working memory could come up in a lot of different areas as well. In math, and just holding information together to comprehend reading as well. So I think those two areas are very interesting to keep an eye on when you have a child who's being tested. Because again, it helps you document and really give more evidence to why your child is struggling in the classroom in the way that the child is struggling. And again, whatever meeting you're in, make sure you document what happened. If your child now has an IEP, I think it's really important to set up communication, especially weekly, especially in the beginning. Because I still hear stories about IEPs in place and, kids are struggling. So that could be happening because it's not followed. It could be happening because maybe a teacher doesn't know the child has an IEP, or, maybe sometimes the IEPs need to be tweaked. But you don't know that unless you have communication between home and school. So I think that it's really important. I think that if you have a child in middle school or high school, these teachers are not going to want to have to necessarily call you every week. Sometimes you can have the case manager be the go-between and can gather that information on a weekly basis to ensure that the way you have the IEP set up now is the way to keep it set up for now if it's successful, if that makes sense. The IDEA does put a lot of importance on parent participation. School cannot hold IEP meetings and make changes without the parent. Absolutely not. There are court cases to prove that as well. Many times teachers or schools are reaching out to set up a meeting, and consistently parents can't make it and ask for different dates. And in this particular case, the date was not working for the parent. So the school ended up having an IEP meeting, made major changes without that parent. and then had a follow-up meeting with the parent. So the courts decided that that was not following the IDEA, that unless you have a parent that says, I don't want to participate, they must be at these meetings and no changes can be made. You are truly part of the team. These goals must align with grade level academic standards. You know, there has to be, you know, where do we have to go with this child? How much progress can be made and should be made based on the grade level? It is a provision of special education to meet the unique needs, which is to prepare for further education, employment, and independent living. You can have related services like speech and OT, and of course, lots and lots of accommodations, modifications. And you know, there's just hundreds of them. And again, I would caution you to just be aware that they need to be individualized for your child. Seating and testing and all that stuff is fine as long as it's specific to the needs of your child. And that to me is important. So I think the key points to all of this is these are so important. Documentation, and that's really before, during, and after all of this process. Communication before, during, and after as well. To remember that parents are an important part and a full member of the IEP team. Always avoid going alone to these meetings. Bring notes. And make sure you know your procedural safeguards. When your child has an IEP, you, the parent, have procedural safeguards. You have rights. And when you are in a meeting, that first IEP meeting, make sure you're given the booklet regarding those rights. And hopefully you never have to use them. And of course, I certainly promote the need to start out, you know, you don't want to be in a combative place with a school. You want to start out with small areas and move forward, always documenting the data, because nobody can argue with data and nobody can argue with what you've written. So I think that's really important. Certainly there's going to be times that certain procedural safeguards will come into play, but hopefully, certainly nothing like the due process safeguard that is there. You don't want to go through that if you can avoid it. So that is the end of my webinar. Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to write in the Q&A box, and I'll give you time to do that. No, I don't hear you, and I'm in the chat box now, and this is recorded. I don't know. The person who asked me that probably isn't here now. Oh, well. But yes, it is. This is recorded. So again, you can type in questions in the chat box. You can type in questions in the Q&A box. Oh, that's good. Then you know. Yes, it is. Where can I find out about the accommodations? So I'm assuming you mean what kind of accommodations you could have for your child? Well, I think, I mean, certainly it's good to have a knowledge base about accommodations, but I also think it's important that the school can recommend those accommodations based on what you and they are seeing happening in the classroom. You know, there's just so many issues that can happen that need individualized accommodations, whether it be, you know, some kind of a technology. You need to have directions. You need to have the ability to use a phone to take a picture of what's happening on the board, or you need email assignments, homework assignments emailed, a lot of stuff like that. I think, there's general accommodations that I didn't want to, bore everybody with 100 of them, because some of them just don't work for everyone. But I think it's just important to focus as a team on what the struggles are and what can be done to help that child overcome those struggles, not just generic accommodations. Let me see if I can. I want to make sure I didn't leave anybody out here. I feel the school doesn't give me any data on the progress and behaviors, and I don't see in advance. Well, they should. If you have an IEP, you should be getting quarterly data on the progress of those goals. If you think your child is having some behaviors in school, but you're not really being given information, I guess, first of all, for some reason, a lot of times, districts don't deal with those behaviors. They believe that they're controllable by that child, and they're punitive about that. And that is not true at all, right? Their behaviors are part of their disability. So if you have a child with behaviors and you sense that there are things going on and you're not being told, then I would ask for an IEP meeting, because you can ask any time and discuss it. And discuss the fact that you're not getting data. Discuss the fact that if you're not seeing in advance, which means you're saying that they're not meeting goals, that should be looked at. And I have no doubt you're right about that. I feel like sometimes IEPs are made and then they're just ignored. They're not followed, and people only meet with the team annually. A lot happens in a year. And so if things are happening and you don't know, and the goals become not achievable, or they've been achieved and you need other goals added, that's why you really need more than one meeting during the year. So in your case, I would certainly ask for an IEP meeting to discuss what you're seeing. Can I get help with homework in an IEP? Yeah, definitely. And you can also, that's the other tough thing with our kids. They have distractibility issues, they have focus issues. So the homework that they have, the same homework as their same age peers have, the same age peers can get it done, let's say in an hour, where it might take them 4 hours, literally, right? So you could get a modification of homework so that your child wouldn't be receiving the same amount of homework as a child without the disability. And then if there's a need for help, then that kind of spells out a whole lot of other issues regarding the comprehension of what's going on and how to do homework, and that has to be watched. Do they have to do data for a 504 plan? Well, I don't think it's written anywhere, but I still think that if you have a plan like that in place, there should be still communication around, accommodations. So like the difference here is, it is general education, but it's not as structured. Yeah, you know that, right? So you don't have goals that have to be followed. You don't have plans in place. You pretty much have accommodations in place. So I think that where you may not have specific data like an IEP, you can still set up communication with the person who is running the 504s. I think it's really important. You do have to make sure you get that communication. In that case, whether you call it data or whether you call it consistent communication. It's got to be there to know that it's working, or your child suffers. So yeah, I think it's important. Sorry guys, I'm trying to find all these. My 15-year-old is currently at a residential facility. He has ADHD and OD. They have a school which the school district is refusing to evaluate him for an IEP. We had a meeting. They are also refusing to pay for his education. They said his behavior is all at home, yet was failing while there. He also has substance issues. I haven't gone to due process. I believe he would qualify for OHI. On August 6th, he had DSM-5, also diagnosed with DMDD. I'm trying to articulate what we are trying to achieve with an IEP. He had a 504, and the child study team said we didn't give the 504 enough time to work. Well, you have a lot of issues here. That's one of the things that I talked about, that sometimes that will be said if you've been trying to push for an IEP. I think that, I'm sorry, I don't know why this is not open. I think that they can easily say that if a child hasn't had a 504 long enough and there hasn't been enough document to ensure that it does or doesn't work. You know, so that is something that I think just requires more communication and data to ensure that. As far as your other questions, I think it's a complicated picture, and I would be happy to talk to you offline on an email and a consult, because I think that's an awful lot of issues going on. But I will definitely reach out to you privately. But again, I think at least in the 504 area, I think that you need to have more data and communication around how important these accommodations are, or how, if they're working. My questions about processing working memory in regards to testing and coming up average in his testing scores. Okay, well, again, those things are sub-scores, and they average them under a bunch of other scores, and they come up average. So I guess it kind of depends, unless you're saying that processing and working memory individually are coming up average. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they come up below average, and all the rest of the testing is middle or high average. So you still see that discrepancy in that child. It's all individual. In that child, those are areas that are lower. And again, I'm not pushing for you guys to just like focus on test scores and argue those points. I'm saying that they can be evidence that kind of gives and promotes the fact that the struggles you see in the classroom relate to what is happening on paper. You know, and that may or may not resonate with whomever you're speaking to, but again, what specific struggles are happening in the classroom that would relate to those areas. Because very likely, I see it time and time again where kids are not tested as learning disabled, but these are areas that impact them for sure. No doubt about that. How could processing not be affected in a child with ADHD? But here's the thing as well. Those scores could be higher and not reflect the reality of a classroom, right? Because the testing is one-on-one. So the focus is, or it could be, a little better one-on-one. So I think even more important than that, if the correlation isn't there, is again to really document what you see in the classroom. I know I sound like a broken record, but I mean, I really do believe that. Does anybody else have any questions? Just see if I missed anything. I'm in the same boat. Start emailing, create that paper trail. I've gotten to the point where I got to make some noise. They don't like it, but I put it in terms of help me help you to help him. Yes. Yes. Help me help you to help him. And that's a really nice way of putting it. But you do have to start a paper trail, and there's no doubt about that. My son has a 504 plan currently. We just met to discuss the plan to see if it's working, and they took multiple tests stating what you said regarding all of his scores came up average. So how would I speak to his processing working memory in the email response I send back? I don't know if you had a full evaluation or not, or if you had those scores that were specific to the working memory and processing speed, but that would depend on, I don't know what kind of evaluation he had. But again, you know, they can't ignore you when you are, again, like I said before, documenting what is happening in the classroom. You are showing difficulty accessing education. That means something, and that's what you need to do.